But yeah, you should just feel free to chime in. So I'm Dustin Atlas, Director of Jewish Studies at Queen's University, but the main guest today, or person of import, is Alana Vincent, who's the Associate Professor in History of Religions at Umeå University, Sweden. I don't know how well I pronounced that. She specializes
You actually got it right.
Nice. She specializes in modern Judaism, Holocaust memory, and the interdisciplinary study of religion and the arts. She has an embarrassingly large number of books, including in Culture, Communion, and Recovery, Making Memory, Jewish and Christian Explorations in Monument, Narrative, and Liturgy, and Jewish Thought, Utopia, and Revolution. But today we're going to be talking about her forthcoming book, so far named The Consequences of Imagination, until it is renamed by an editor with a hatchet. So today we're just going to focus on having a discussion about the text. People can enter questions in the chat, or if there's an appropriate pause, even speak. And yeah, we're going to try to not take this too long, both for the sake of Alana's brain and also just to get all the juiciest stuff out as quickly as possible. And I'm going to begin with the world's most irritating question, which is, what's the book about?
The book is about kind of exactly what the title says. It's about the way that we imagine genocide, and especially post-genocide repair and reconciliation, and the consequences that those imaginal structures have on the way that we actually behave in the real world. So I start from my background in Holocaust studies, observing that the Holocaust has kind of become the main paradigm through which, at least we in the Anglophone West, think about genocide, think about disaster, think about irreparable harm. And therefore, that is the case to which we turn when we are thinking, first of all, about whether something happening in the world is bad enough to be concerned about, and second, about the ways in which we articulate that concern and the way we frame what an appropriate intervention and an appropriate or reasonable reparative gesture might be. Now, there are problems with the way that we treat the Holocaust as the paradigmatic bad thing to which all other bad things have to be compared. Some of those problems are subtle, some of them are really, really obvious. So fairly early on in the book, I do bring in two other comparative cases that I lay alongside Holocaust memory. And one of those is the debate over reparations for transatlantic slavery. And the other is actually good Canadian content for us here. It's the Truth and Reconciliation Commission on Residential Schools and the treatment of calls to action that came from the Truth and Reconciliation process. And what I end up trying to tease out between these three cases is about the way that our concept of harm initially frames what we think about as appropriate repair, and then the ways that actually, if we really start to push it, um, claims about appropriate repair and restitution become less straightforward than our, I think, standard common understanding of Holocaust restitution might lead us to believe, because actually Holocaust restitution legally has been relatively straightforward, in a way that these other two cases are not. Holocaust restitution is pretty much about very concrete losses and damages to individuals and claims being made against named individual entities, you know, people, corporations, rather than claims made by entire communities against entire communities. So that's the interesting academic philosophical stuff. The other thing I'm doing in this book, though, because I'm interested in imagination, in the way that everyday people conceive of these things rather than the way that legal scholars conceive of them, I'm also framing this mostly through close readings of comic books and superhero movies, which are a really strangely great archive of disasters and mass death that then people have to deal with or not deal with in some way. So I have a feeling that either Dustin has frozen or I have. That would have been Dustin.
That
Okay,
answers that.
Jenny and Lucas, it's all us. I just ran out of stuff to say. So someone ask a question.
You finished answering his question just in time for him to disappear. So
Yep.
Whatever. Well done, you.
It was a great answer.
It was a great answer. So since it's me, tell me more about the comic book side. Yeah, I mean, because I loved the poster and the way that you had like Magneto's mask. Who designed that, by the way?
I designed that in about 10 minutes while suffering from a head cold. It is not the best design work I've ever done in my life.
The helmet frames the image. I mean, I thought that kind of evoked interesting intertextual ideas about looking at these real world phenomena through the comic book frame. So talk more about that while Dustin logs back in.
Yeah, so the first thing I look at in this book is actually the history of the representation of Magneto as a Holocaust survivor, because you will appreciate this, Jenny, in the way that probably very few other people will. When we take all of those changes, I will say, for people watching this at home who don't know this history, Magneto appears in the early 1960s. He's the first major villain in the X-Men. And he's a completely stock standard comic book villain. He has no motivation except to just be cacklingly evil for the sake of being evil and cackling. He gives the X-Men someone to fight. As the comic progresses, and particularly starting in the late 70s, early 80s, when there's a change of writer, Magneto starts developing a much deeper backstory, and that backstory ends up being he's a Holocaust survivor. He was at Auschwitz. Maybe he was in the Sonderkommando. And his entire villain motivation is to make sure that if this ever happens again, it doesn't happen to his people, right? He's not never again means never again for anyone. He really is very straightforwardly, mutants should be supreme, and if we don't make ourselves supreme, then humanity is going to kill us, so we should kill them first. And then that becomes more complicated and softens, and he becomes kind of an anti-hero and then an outright hero. It goes back and forth. But when we take the changes in the way that Magneto is represented and kind of chart them out on an old-fashioned timeline, and then we take the old-fashioned timeline of what's happening in academic debates about Holocaust representation, these things are both kind of changing in parallel. The way that Magneto is being represented in this, super popular media mirrors the way that people involved in these much more cloistered debates about Holocaust representation, Holocaust uniqueness, how should we remember, what should we remember, are having with each other. So weirdly, Magneto becomes this, almost finger on the pulse index for what the concerns about Holocaust representation are at any given moment in time.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I agree, since I'm
Yeah.
writing that book,
Yeah.
that part of that book. I also wonder if you have given any thought or would like to think through with me right now, because I was just thinking about this as you were saying it. There's also a way in which that early 80s Claremont shift kind of foreshadowed some of the way that Holocaust conversation goes now, in the unwillingness to say Jews, the sort of that weird thing that we're seeing so much in common political discourse, where people will recognize Holocaust Remembrance Day and not mention Jews, and the way that the narrative around the Holocaust gets awkwardly de-Judaized at points, which is sort of where it started with him, and then went the opposite direction when they eventually Judaized him.
Yeah, and that came really late. The 90s Magneto was, I think, kind of the height of that awkwardness. Oh no, he's really a gypsy. Maybe he's Sinti, maybe he's Roma. We can't quite make up our minds. Maybe it's all an assumed identity. Anyways, definitely, something very bad happened to him, but it wasn't because he was Jewish. He's working for Israel, but don't think that means he's Jewish. I don't know. There's the interesting thing to me about the comics is because they are not really a single author production. Claremont is obviously the driving force in a lot of this, but he's negotiating with a much larger team. And so the questions are always kind of, well, who's driving, which interests are being served, which interests in the production of this narrative are coming into conflict? How much of this, there are, if you go, and again, Jenny, I'm I know you've done this. If anyone else listening to this goes to look at the Claremont papers in Columbia, at the library there are script notes for some of the late 90s, early 2000s stuff, when Claremont is coming back to the book and taking on the helm, where the chief editor is saying, remember, Genosha is not Israel. We are sick and tired of all of this, very thinly veiled metaphor. Can you please do something different? And by the way, not everyone loves Kitty Pryde as much as you do.
That is a lie. Everyone loves Kitty Pryde.
Well, obviously that's a lie. Kitty Pryde is the best thing that Chris Claremont ever did in his entire life, and she just needs to be in every book. But yeah, that's so there's looking at that 90s moment, there's this tug of war, right? Where on the one hand, we've got Magneto, the Mossad agent, and Magneto, the unabashed representative of Jewish power and Israeli military dominance, and on the other hand, this refusal to be decisive about why he's actually, whether he is actually Jewish or not, which of these multiple nested identities is the real identity, and which of these are cover stories. For me, the interesting moment there is not, that tug of war. It's interesting, it's weird, it's very 90s. The resolution in my reading is the 2000 film, where Bryan Singer is directing, and he does that Schindler's List ripoff opening scene with Magneto and his family at Auschwitz. And his comment on that was, well, it's not that I wanted Magneto to be Jewish, but I definitely wanted this set at Auschwitz. I wanted that part of his backstory. And I know historically, when you set something at Auschwitz, everyone on the ramp by the train is wearing a yellow star. And it would have just been really awkward to not put one on Magneto too. So I guess that meant he had to be Jewish, right? It's that's the moment at which Holocaust survivor and Jewish become inseparable. And the contestation over Magneto's identity, in so far as, well, we know he's a Holocaust survivor, does that mean that he's Jewish, goes away. And it's after that we start seeing, these really unambiguous representations like X-Men Magneto Testament, kind of these very pious Holocaust representations involving Magneto.
Is my back? Can you hear me?
We can hear you. You don't have video, but we can hear you.
I'm happy to be an ever-present voice without a body. And I think I've heard almost everything, but I'm worried I missed something. So forgive me if this next question, and thank you, Sarah, for filling in as the voice. So I want to just move away for a second from the Holocaust to this sort of more general discussion of reconciliation in your work. For example, examining the relationship of Indigenous people in Canada, and how does reflection on Jewish philosophy help illuminate these arguably very different issues? Like how do you connect them to the sort of unfolding memory slash collective guilt response to the Holocaust?
Yeah. So the third strand that I have working in this book is a set of fairly close readings of Hannah Arendt, starting with Eichmann in Jerusalem, and then a number of the texts that she wrote after Eichmann in response to critiques of Eichmann, which is where a lot of her work on collective responsibility comes from. Because there's this thing in Arendt that has been bothering me for years. And I still haven't resolved it. I probably won't resolve it by the time I finish this book either. Her entire framing of responsibility and guilt, etc., is individual. It's person to person, right? The guilty must be specifically guilty persons, where in a society where all are guilty, no one is truly guilty. And she gestures from time to time towards this vague idea that maybe responsibility is different from guilt in some vague way, but she never really resolves that clearly. Because, well, frankly, I think she's just not interested in those questions. And that becomes, that goes back to what I was saying earlier about the problem of Holocaust reparations being kind of our paradigm for thinking through harm and repair, because it's pretty much individual to individual. And that thinking doesn't work in the case of, well, let's stick with residential schools. The idea that harm and repair should be conceived of on that individual level is in fact what blocked every attempt at a residential school lawsuit up until the early 2000s, because the details of each case that was brought were just different enough that the judiciary could deny class action status, which meant that every single residential school survivor trying to bring a claim had to bring a claim all by themselves, with just their individual resources. And in the event that that claim was decided in their favor, which usually it wasn't, the resources to pay that claim were also limited. This is still the struggle that we have with the Catholic Church's insistence that responsibility for Catholic participation in residential schools lies with these very specific tiny missionary orders, all of whom are conveniently bankrupt. And therefore, they might have moral responsibility, but they can't possibly be expected to actually meet that responsibility with a restitution payment. Right? there's this gap in our ability to conceive of not just harm, but also responsibility and repair on a collective level. And I would love to tell you that Jewish philosophy offers a great set of tools for addressing that gap. Unfortunately, I can't. I think actually, at least the parts of Jewish philosophy that I have spent my life reading make the problem worse, because they look like, the thinkers I work with, mainly Arendt, she looks like she's talking exactly about this area, and then she never gets anywhere with it. So yeah, the problem and the challenge is to pick through what is there in the philosophical record and name the insufficiency, and then build on that towards a solution. For me, that means moving beyond Jewish thought and, again, entering into conversation with indigenous voices. And I'm spending a lot of time, especially in the later chapters in this book, with Sarah Ahmed. Thinkers from traditions that do have a little bit more to say about collective existence.
That's odd in that, insofar as like the sort of cliche, at least, is like, which obviously I don't buy into. And Christianity as a sort of individual religion, Judaism as the like sort of philosophical source for thinking about collectives. And it's interesting to find that wanting, at least in the legal. Sorry. But
yeah, Sorry, we don't have video, so we can't.
Okay,
I can't
so
see
sorry,
the look on your
see
face.
My gesticulations,
Yeah.
which I promise you are very, like, they're very professorial. But I was wondering specifically, and I think part of this is abstract, like what, crudely speaking, is the relationship between memory and imagination that you're holding on in the text, right? Because there does seem to be, if I understand correctly, you have basically three sort of, at least in the part I've been able to read, you have sort of collectives and responsibility, what the relationship is there, memory and imagination as sort of three major focal points spinning. And asking you to draw a connection between all three would be cruel, but I guess I'm wondering what's the relationship between memory and imagination, especially vis-a-vis this sort of problem of responsibility. So I guess I did just ask all three. Sorry.
Yeah, you kind of did. So, fun story. For the last few years, in my last position in England before I moved to Sweden, I was running the philosophy program, which was a little bit weird. And I was co-teaching with someone who was very much more from the analytical tradition than I am. And yeah, there was a lot of compromise involved. Even just on basic things like what subjects do we cover when we have to teach this level 1 introduction to philosophy, because if we each just chose topics that we naturally gravitated to, our poor students would have whiplash. we ended up compromising on philosophy of mind, and I think our poor students still had whiplash. And this is a very long-winded way of saying, from one perspective, to which I am pretty sympathetic, memory and imagination are both mental faculties. They're things that happen entirely in our minds. The extent to which either relies on external stimuli or is firmly connected to an external reality is actually really complicated. And this comes back to those long-running debates about Holocaust fictionalization, because of course one of the fears that underlies any discussion of Holocaust representation, Holocaust fictionalization, is precisely that by transforming the Holocaust into something that lives in the mind, into memory or imagination, we are severing it from its claim to objective reality. That's a concern, but also that's, to me, a concern about something that had already happened in 1948. Because even from that moment, the past lives in the mind and in the historical record and in documents and in artifacts, but it lives in the mind. So, and the further we move from the point of the original event, the more it lives in the mind. So that at this point, when we talk about collective memory and cultural memory, we are talking about acts of the imagination. We're talking about the guardrails that we put on those acts of the imagination in order to keep them within some acceptable, range of tethering to objective external reality, but we're mostly, the question is not should the Holocaust be imagined, it's about how, right? And once we accept that, then we're back to those questions about how this set of imaginings about harm and disaster shapes our imaginings about other forms of harm and disaster. And
oh, I see. Okay, so
yeah.
So if I understand you correctly, the further you are from the event, the more memory is not exactly supplanted by imagination, but sort of filled out and developed by it, right? So
thank you. That was a very concise version of what I just spent 15 minutes trying to say.
That's all I do is reprocess what other people say. So I guess I want to know then, and I know the book is not just about comics, so why comics specifically, not just pop culture, but specifically comics? And for my sake, avoid the movies for a second, just because I've read the comics, but I've not seen the movies. And also, why aren't for this sort of way that this? So the interrelationship between memory and imagination over time. Why are comics a good way of studying that, and why aren't a good way of thinking about it? That's two questions.
Okay. Yeah, that is, but
okay, comics first.
Yeah, well, I'm actually going to tell you to watch the video when it goes up on YouTube, because I think that was that kind of long conversation between Jenny and I while you were trying to log back in was
okay. Fair
yeah.
enough.
Yeah. Although here's the other thing about comics. First of all, I actually did not start out doing this as a book on comics. I started out doing, much more broadly stuff about dystopia, starting from the observation that pretty much every dystopian novel that has been written, certainly since the 1950s, is a Holocaust novel. I mean, the tropes of what a dystopia looks like are largely Holocaust tropes. But the thing about dystopian novels is their resolutions are kind of limited. I mean, either you find out where things went wrong and the heroes can do something heroic to reset things so the dystopia gets on back to normal. There's that moment of liberation. Or they don't. And the dystopia just kind of keeps on being dystopic. There isn't a lot of movement there in terms of, well, hang on, short of. And now everything went back to normal and they all lived happily ever after. That, where else do you go? So I started looking for forms of media that had a similar relationship to, the way they present and imagine harm, but had a little bit more flexibility in what they do with repair. And, well, frankly, I grew up on X-Men, as did so many other people. And there I saw, yes, there's a lot of those classic dystopian Holocausty tropes, but there's also a much wider range of because these are stories that have gone in a lot of different directions. And then, well, at the same time, the movies start coming out, and I know you have different feelings about the movies, but there's also something really interesting happening in the way that stories from the 80s, the early 2000s are being retold and repackaged for, yes, a different medium, but also a different audience. And here again, I think there is something interesting happening in the way that a comic, like a 90s comic book appropriate resolution versus a 2020 film appropriate resolution to a similar set of events have diverged from each other. So again, this, because the medium is stories that are told and retold over time, it's a useful, interesting way to kind of track what, quote unquote, the general public thinks of as intuitively just and satisfying.
Okay, so I'll turn over to Jenny again for some questions because I don't want to hog all the remaining minutes. But so it's, as much as anything, it's a diagnostic, or what I guess a more Marxist would call like sort of a view of spirit, right? You find spirit in the movies, blah blah blah, right? So that's why you can do a Freudian reading of the movies, because the movies in
Well,
some
maybe
respects,
you could do a Freudian reading of the movies,
sorry,
friend.
One
One.
can, because the movies are sort of in some respect exhibit some ambiguous thing called spirit, which is as ambiguous as collective memory or any other collective thing, right? Like we can see,
Yeah.
and you're playing on the gap between the film and the comic. What is, if you could like just say one, what is the big shift between the two, and what does that illuminate? Or have you already said that?
So that I had not already said, because Jenny and I were mostly talking about Magneto because that's a big common interest. Yeah, so it's not surprising that the films want things to be simpler. I mean, that's kind of the nature of the medium in a way. So for example, the Infinity Saga. It's got a pretty short, quick resolution in the recent film. It's got a longer, more drawn out resolution in the comic books because, they're comic books. They have a little bit more space. They want people to buy the next monthly issue, etc. But the way that they shorten that resolution is still interesting. So in the film, we'll recall, or if you're not recalling, I'm telling you for the first time and just completely spoiling a movie that's been out for over 2 years. So yeah, get over it. The whole thing with Thanos and the Infinity Gauntlet is solved by the super smart superheroes sciencing really hard so that they can travel back in time, collect their own set of the Infinity Stones, and snap Thanos out of existence before he can snap half the life of the universe back into existence, and then snap Thanos out of existence. So the threat is completely gone. And they all live happily ever after, except for the ones that don't at the end. It's a highly individualized approach to saving the world, right? It's a team, but it's a team of individuals working from their individual capacities. In the comic book, they take the Infinity Gauntlet away from Thanos. They give it to Adam Warlock. He hangs on to it until things go a little bit wrong with him for complicated reasons that we don't need to delve into. And eventually, how is this resolved? The Living Tribunal intervenes. The avatar of justice and balance in the universe comes and says, this is not working. You cannot have that toy anymore. Now, it's not just that the Warlock part of the Infinity Saga took a lot longer to work itself out. That's changed. That's not the important change. The important change is comic books, 90s. There is still an idea that we are living in a looked after universe. And there is a point at which things can get so topsy-turvy that some outside force is going to intervene. There is no other reasonable resolution. That is what's gone by 2020. Right? So that's one example of the kind of change that I'm indexing.
Okay, so the writer's eye or God's eye view is, or not God's eye view, God's eye corrector. No one's there to read the scales.
And therefore, it's kind of up to the people there to sort it out themselves, which they'll do because they're heroic.
Yeah, no, I expect still a sort of cloying resolution, but and so in your writing, you said Ben Gurion is a model for one of these characters in the comics.
Oh, Ben Gurion was the model for. I am just blanking. Jenny, help me out here.
The Watcher of some sort. Yes.
Yes, no? Thank you. Yeah, no, the Watcher. And it's very much it's a very physical model, right?
I remembered it.
He is drawn.
The second you said it, I was like, oh, that's that guy. I remembered immediately. But I mean, I don't remember the content of the comics, but I remember the image from being a little kid. Yeah, no. So, but is that I'm assuming is no longer part of this sort of story anymore. So forgive me. I'll just go back, leaving the trivia aside.
No, well, here's the interesting trivia, because when the Watcher does, or does he? Huh. Okay, I have not reviewed this material for like a while, so I could be saying something completely incorrect.
And you have to watch, because comic book people are worse than academics when it comes to small errors, right? There's no one more violent and sort of, histrionic than a comic book nerd when you've said something incorrectly. But anyway, continue. Sorry.
Yeah, I know. How do you think I managed to survive in academia this long? I was well trained for it. But no, I do vaguely recall that in one of the post-credit scenes in one of the pre-Infinity Wars movies, the Watcher does appear, and this is where I may be getting this wrong. I can't remember whether the Watcher is played by Stan Lee or whether the Watcher is just having a conversation with another character who's played by Stan Lee.
That one.
That one. Okay, thank you. Yep. So the Ben Gurion resemblance has flown out the window by that point.
Okay.
Yeah.
Jenny, do you have any questions before I hog up the remaining moments?
Well, I did have one that was coming up as I was listening to your conversation with Dustin a couple of questions ago. I'm almost feeling suddenly this like Benedict Anderson outgrowth, where if the nation is an imagined community to start with, built on imagined geography of contemporary borders, then how can we have anything but imagined catastrophes and responses to them? Like, how can this not all be taking place in the realm of imagination, since we've built our contemporary political landscape on fictions to begin with, right?
No, I think that's absolutely right. And yeah, Anderson is woven through the footnotes of this book pretty tightly. And actually, Anderson, the more I think back on like every piece of writing I do, it's basically working Anderson out to more and more extreme extents. So, but here's the important thing that I think we talk often about imagination dismissively, right? Imagination is a problem for Holocaust representation because if it's just an imagination, then that robs it of its reality. That's not how this works, right? Imagination is actually what sets the limits of the possibility for anything we do materially. Our imagined community, it's not that the disaster itself is imagined, but our relation to disaster is determined by our place in the imagined community which the disaster impacts. We react very differently to a natural disaster or a mass shooting or a bomb going off in Australia than to one in Indonesia. And that's nothing to do with geography. Yeah, so I know, yeah, part of what I am trying to do here is make the argument for just acknowledging that and owning that and then working from it.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah. I was also put in mind as you were talking about the way that all of this is essentially mental work. It was reminding me too, which I'm sure you've already like talked about in other things, but Rachel Gross's recent stuff on nostalgia and the just like it's just all a continuum of the stories we tell ourselves, sometimes on purpose, but more often not consciously. I mean, and maybe we're getting back to Freud now, but the myth making that we, and sort of just what you were saying about the way that imagination kind of gets poo-pooed sometimes. And I don't know if you've had a chance yet to read Jodi Eckley-Levine's thing yesterday about the Muppets. I thought the whole section on kind of ludic play and the importance of these fictions that we so often denigrate, I thought that was really important. And that's part of why I appreciate the way that you tie so much of this into not just pop culture, but the stuff that often gets thrown out as low pop culture, like comic books. So I mean, I'm really grateful to have had the chance to listen to you talk about this, and obviously I'm anxiously awaiting the book.
You and me both.
Yeah, right. I know.
I have a question. Am I coming through again? I can't.
Yeah.
Okay, amazing. So obviously I'm going to be really annoying and move away from culture again because I can't help myself. Have you done any play with medieval Jewish or Islamic thought about imagination, where imagination is actually very highly valued rather than modern Jewish thought, which seems to follow the Maimonidean line of, or that kind of German obsession with moving beyond the image, right? Like real thought isn't in an image; it's some sort of pure logical or absolute form. Have you done any play with any of the more sort of, I don't know, I think Braderman's working one up, but there's a sort of sub-tradition in Jewish thought that views imagination as A, inextricably linked to the political, but also B, kind of the outside of truth, right? Like it's part, and not the outside as in it stands outside of it, but is like literally the surface of truth, like how you see it. That's a deeply annoying question to put this far into the talk. I apologize, but this is my job. So
it's okay. I'm going to give you a deeply annoying answer.
yeah.
No.
Yeah, that's what I figured you would say.
I-
Well, just because
I-
Arendt is in this German tradition. This is her weakness, right? She has a very hard time with imagination.
So the short answer is no. The slightly longer answer is no, because I am fundamentally a 20th century person, and I have dug myself all the way back to 18th century thought. I'm doing pretty well here at the excavation. But also, I mean, the thing that fascinates me about in the German Jewish philosophical tradition in general, and Arendt in particular, Arendt is the one that I just can't put down, even when I really deeply hate what's happening there and passionately disagree with it. It's the train wreck I can't look away from. That the way that Jewishness is conceived of and reconceived in conversation with that wider, okay, we are all going to be good Enlightenment citizens now. Judaism has always been an Enlightenment religion. That's the tension that I keep needing to pick at and poke at, and the way that works itself out, not just in philosophical discourse, but again in wider discourses about cultural authenticity and what real authentic Jewish culture looks like or doesn't look like.
Well, no, and I like your reading or your position of Arendt because of the idiotic hostility towards her, I often end up in a more defensive position. So it was nice to see someone who was neither defensive nor offensive, but actually just reading the texts, which is in an odd way a thing that I think has often been neglected. But she's a good bridge outside of Jewish thought too, because she is more capable outside of that world than a lot of her compatriots.
She's maybe a little bit more capable outside of that world than she is in it.
Yeah. Actually, that's a good point. But yeah, no, I think the way you position her is very nice.
Yeah. Well, I'll say that, and then I'll immediately turn around and say, which actually makes her the model of a 20th century Jewish thinker.
Yeah, I could see that. That sounds right. I mean, obviously, as a committed Buberian, we'd have to argue about that. But yeah, I think I have a strong feeling for the project, and I hope anyone who's watching this later will develop one as well, and more than that, an interest in reading the book when it's finally finished. But does anyone have any more questions, or do you have any sort of final last words? I guess it sounds a little ominous. Jenny, do you have anything? That's
no, I mean, I don't want to keep dragging the conversation back to my stuff, because Alana and I can just talk about my stuff later.
I've been dragging it to my stuff the entire time. I think that's fine.
You hosted the talk.
Yeah, well, no, I'm
yeah,
also...
but you're the bonus guest, Jenny.
Yeah, exactly. So you can have the final word if you want to drag it back to your stuff one more time.
I guess I just had one other question, and if the answer is no, then it doesn't need to go anywhere, and if it's yes, we can have a short conversation about it. Do you also, in your consideration of the way that some of these conversations playing out in comics map onto what was going on in contemporary conversations about genocide and reconciliation and all of this. Do you look at Rory Regan, Ragman stuff, or do you stay with Marvel?
I stay with Marvel for this book because as we've heard, this is, in a way, it's almost 3 books sitting side by side. So limiting it, however artificially,
Sure.
that becomes necessary if I want to ever finish. Only one more chapter left to write. It's the one about land
Oh, that'll be non-fraud.
and
Yeah, no,
That'll be very-
ethno-nationalism and reproductive futurity. Yeah,
easy peasy.
exactly. So
I'm glad you're avoiding the non-contentious stuff. Or avoiding the contentious, it doesn't matter. Anyway, well, here normally is where I would try to look even more professorial, but I want you to thank you for coming and talking to us. I really appreciate it. I also appreciate you putting up with the sort of technological glitches. And thank you, Jenny, for being the co-host, uninvited and accidental, but stepping in like a superhero yourself. And that's it. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Alana. And thank you, Allison, in the background for setting up and monitoring everything and getting me back on after I was booted.
and thank you so
Justin,
much for having me.
Of
Yeah,
course.
this has been a pleasure.
A rare delight. Thank you kindly.